Welcome to episode 2 of Let's Translate Light Novels. We're going to be looking at Seiranden, which is a prequel to the anime Shigeyugi. It's about Nakago's past. And in this video, we're going to be focusing on some really long run-on sentences in this light novel. We're going to figure out how to parse them and how to translate run-on sentences. But before we start, I have some notes and some disclaimers.
The objective of this series is not to walk away with a finished translation of this novel. In actual fact, we're probably only going to get through the first several pages. The purpose of this series is to teach Japanese grammar and vocabulary. Additionally, the series' objective is to show how you can take your understanding of Japanese and turn it into a proper translation. To demonstrate this, I'll be comparing and contrasting translations of this novel that I did in the year 2000 when I was at the intermediate level and completely new to translating, with translations from some of my patrons as well as my insights today as a professional translator with over 15 years experience. I do not own the rights to Seiranden, and I did not get permission from the author Nishizaki Megumi to translate it. So again, I would like to emphasize that the intention of this video series is not to produce a translation of this book, but to teach Japanese and to show how translation can be done. I won't be naming my patrons who have contributed their translations in these videos, but I will credit them in the video description if they wish. And now, on to the video.
So as I mentioned, this is part 2. We are starting with page 2 of the book now, so if you haven't seen part 1 yet, you might want to watch that. So here's a line of dialogue. Soro soro okoshi ni naru. ... Soro soro, that's usually used when you're saying someone will arrive shortly or something is going to start shortly. So soro soro, it's about to. Okoshi ni naru, so this is a very noble way of saying somebody will come, somebody will arrive, somebody will bless us or grace us with their presence, basically. So my patron translated this as, he will be here soon, with 4 dots. And then small Sarah translated this without quotation marks. I have a theory on why this is the case. He should arrive any minute now, exclamation point. So small Sarah might have left the quotation marks out simply because she was typing on a Japanese computer and didn't know where to find the quotation marks. They're in a different place on Japanese computers, and I remember struggling with that at first. So that might be why small Sarah did not have quotation marks there. She might have just, been like, ah. And the quotation marks that are around the other quotes earlier, I might have gone back and added those after the fact, but I forgot to add them here. That's my theory on why there's no quotation marks. The exclamation point also, instead of the very long ellipses, that might have been because in Japanese word processing, if you type in ellipses, if you type 3 dots, it raises them. And I didn't know how to undo that. So I might have just been like, exclamation point. Either that or I just mistranscribed it. But yeah, he should arrive any minute now versus he will be here soon. It's the same thing, same meaning, pretty much. Although he will be here soon is shorter and more concise, which usually is what we prefer. So about this ellipses business, just a technical note. I personally don't really care. Just me personally as a reader, I don't really care. But if you're going to be a professional translator, they're very urusai about ellipses. They're very particular about ellipses. Japanese prose often will have ellipses that are 6 dots long or even longer. But in English, it's kind of unnatural and weird to have ellipses that long. I personally, again, I don't mind super long ellipses. I kind of like the length of the ellipses showing how long the pause is. So I like how Japanese ellipses do that. Unfortunately, English ellipses don't do that. If you're ending a sentence with ellipses, you usually just do the ellipses and then there's no period after that. You wouldn't have 4 dots is what I'm saying. You would just have 3. That's the correct punctuation for this line of dialogue. So who is saying this line of dialogue, you may ask? In English prose, you might have said so-and-so after the quotes, but frequently this is not the case in Japanese light novels or novels. But never fear, the next sentence is basically going to tell us who said that. 自分の後ろに隠れるようにして震えている少年の体を, comma. So that's the first part of the sentence. 母は, haha. That's the person who's saying it. 母はそっと前方を押し出した. So the first part of the sentence. 自分の後ろに隠れるようにして震えている少年の体を. So 自分の後ろ, jibun is one of those really elusive pronouns that you can't ever like always translate it the same way, because it really means like oneself. It means yourself, it means myself, it means herself, himself, themselves. It means anyone's self. So jibun no ushiro, behind herself, because we're talking about a mother here. Kakureru you ni shite, so as if to hide. So as if to hide behind her. Furueteiru shounen, the shivering boy, no karada. So the shivering boy's body. Here's another Japaneseism here. Something or another's body. Something or another no karada. You almost always want to just nix the no karada in your translation, because if you say in English the boy's body or like her body or whatever, often we're talking about a dead body. But in Japanese, they're not talking about a dead body. They would say shitai if they're talking about a dead body. But yeah, in English, it can kind of sound like you're talking about a dead body if you say body in this way. So usually you would just nix the karada. So the shivering boy, as if to hide behind her, is kind of what that first part means literally. Haha wa, the mother, sotto, softly, zenpo o oshidashita. So zenpo, if you look at the kanji, it's forward direction. So forward direction. Push, oshidashita, pushed him in a forward direction. Pushed who? Pushed the shivering boy who was as if hiding behind her. That's like what that all means. So my patron translated this as the mother gently pushed his trembling son forward when he tried to hide behind her. So this mother is not a trans male, as far as I know. I mean, who knows? But yeah, her pronouns are she, her. This was just probably a little typo, a little mistake that my patron might have caught later. Typos and little mistakes like this happen. You know, there's bound to be one or two in a book. So don't get too tripped up over that. But yeah, the mother gently pushed her trembling son forward when he tried to hide behind her. So this whole kakureru you ni shite furueteiru, if you'll notice, the complete order of everything that took place in that sentence was flipped when it was translated by my patron, which is good. Often that's what you want to do in your translations. The mother gently pushed forward, used to come at the end, now it's at the beginning. Her trembling son forward. The trembling son used to come in the middle, and it's still in the middle now. When he tried to hide behind her, that used to be at the beginning of the sentence. Jibun no ushiro ni kakureru you ni shite. So that's a good translation. It's a little more clear. The order of operations is still the same. When he tried to tremble behind her doesn't mean that like she pushed him forward and then he tried to tremble behind her. It means she pushed him forward when he was trying to hide behind her. So the order of operations is still the same. He was trembling, trying to hide behind her, and then she pushed him forward. So small Sarah's translation here was the shivering boy, comma, who had been behind his mother as if to hide himself. Oh, I love how bad this is. Was gently brought in front of his mother. Oh, this is beautiful. It's terrible. I mean, it's correct, technically, right? If you look at the words and what they mean, it's still correct. But it's just worded not that well in English. So the shivering boy who had been behind his mother as if to hide himself. Yeah, this whole had been, who had been behind, as if to, you ni shite, even though that literally means like as if to, it's not always a good idea to translate it that way in English. It's just a little too vague, and English usually is a little bolder than that. So the shivering boy who was hiding, trembling behind his mother, like would have been a little bit better way of wording that, was gently brought in front of his mother. So I used passive voice. Small Sarah used passive voice here, even though the Japanese didn't use passive voice. That's kind of funny. Like usually the Japanese will use passive voice, but you translate it in active voice like you're supposed to. I don't know why I did passive voice. Maybe I wasn't really clear that the mother was the one who was bringing him forward, but because Small Sarah used passive voice, it's not necessarily clear that the mother brought him forward. It could have been one of the other tribe people. So yeah, the patron's translation is better, I'd say, than Small Sarah's. It's shorter, it's more concise, the order of operations is still intact, and there's no passive voice. But again, both translations are correct. Then we have another line of dialogue, ka-sama. And if you'll note, there's ellipses on either side of that with 6 dots. So again, more on these ellipses. You might be tempted as a novice translator to translate that as quotation mark, 6 dots, mother, 6 dots, and quotation mark. But that's not right. And as you can see, both my patron and small Sarah translated this the exact same way. Yeah, mother, single ellipses, end quote. That's correct. 怯える我が子に向かい、母は静かにうなずいた. So 怯える is to be afraid. Wagako, so this whole wagako phrase, it just means like her child, or her son. Waga like means my, but it's like her shivering my child. Like you can't translate that literally. It sounds really dumb. So it's just her child. Obieru ko, wagako, her scared child. Nimukai, so she turns to face her scared child, and the mother, haha wa shizuka ni unazuita, quietly nodded. So the mother like turned to face her scared child and quietly nodded is like a literal translation of that. So my patron translated that as the mother silently nodded at the frightened child. And small Sarah translated that as the mother turned to her frightened child and nodded silently. So note, I'm keeping a little bit more of the Japanese syntax, like the way it's worded, intact in this translation that I did 23 years ago. And it's not wrong. Neither of these translations are wrong. They're both correct. But this is a very Japaneseism of writing. Something or another, nimukai, turned to. She turned to him and said, you can still say that in English. It isn't that unnatural. But it's like she turned to him and silently nodded. You can just say she silently nodded at him, and that's what my patron did. The mother silently nodded at the frightened child. I might have said the mother silently nodded at her frightened child, because like then it's made more clear that, okay, she is his mother. It's not just some mother and some child. But yeah, it's a minor, slight little detail there, but it's just a little cleaner and a little more concise to say that she just nodded at him versus she turned to him and nodded. I mean, I guess the one thing that turn to him does is it kind of keeps the order of operations intact. Maybe you picture this in your mind of like, you know, she pushed him forward, he's trembling, and then she turns to him and maybe puts her hands on his shoulders and then nods silently versus just she's already looking at him and then nods silently. There is a slightly different nuance there. But again, usually you want to remove the extraneous stuff of like, well, she turned to him and said, she turned to him and nodded, and just she said to him, she nodded at him. Then another line of dialogue. Sa goran. Goran is like, take a look. And sa is come now, basically. So patron and I had similar translations. Patron, come, comma, take a look, ... Versus come, comma, look, exclamation point. Again, I think, I just suspect that small Sarah changed these ellipses to exclamation points just because she didn't know how. And like, she probably went back because I had a note to myself in here. I used to have this up on my webpage back when I had a webpage in like 2001, 2002. I went back and I did like change some things. Like I kind of cleaned up the prose, I cleaned up the typos and the spelling errors because I did this on a Japanese computer originally with like no spell check or like no English language word processing. I think this is just one of those things that I just didn't quite fix properly, and it's just because of the Japanese word processing that I changed the ellipses to an exclamation point just because it's easier to type. But yeah, come, comma, take a look versus come, comma, look. Really the same thing. I say take a look is probably better because it's more casual. All right, here is a really long sentence followed by another really long sentence. All right. 一族の群れから少し離れた湖畔に佇む母と子は. All right, that's our first part. We have a wa particle. So, しっかり手を握り合い, comma, that's part 2. その時を待った, part 3. So part 1 is very long. So, 母と子は, you can just erase all the stuff that comes before 母と子は. And it'll help you parse the sentence a little bit better. So let's just ignore that part at the beginning for now and start with 母と子は. shikkari te o nigiri ai. So shikkari is like firmly. Te o nigiri ai, grasp each other's hands. Nigiri is just to grasp, but nigiri ai is like to grasp with somebody else who's also grasping. So the mother and son tightly clasped their hands. その時を待った。その時, literally, that time. And then 待った waited. So, その時を待った. The mother and son firmly gripped hands and waited for the moment. The anticipated moment. That's what その時 really means in this case. It doesn't mean that time or that moment. It means like the moment, the moment that they're waiting for, that they're anticipating, that they know is going to come. So now let's go back to the words that came before haha to ko. These are the words that are going to describe the mother and the child. 一族の群れから少し離れた湖畔に佇む. So 佇む is like to kind of stand still. 湖畔に佇む, so to kind of stop and stand by the lakeside. 少し離れた湖畔に, so like a little bit away from, at the lakeside, a little bit away from 一族の群れ. So a mure is a herd or a flock. It's translated a lot of different ways in English. We have a lot of different ways of expressing mure in English, depending on the context and what you're describing. It's a murder of crows, a flock of geese, a herd of cattle, or a crowd or a throng of people. So the crowd of their clan, basically. So the boy and mother who were stopped at the lakeside a little bit away from the throng of their clan, basically is what that means. They gripped hands tightly and they waited for the moment to arrive. So my patron translated this as, the mother and son stood still with clasped hands at the lakeside, a short distance away from the rest of the clan, period. They waited for the time to arrive, period. So aside from translating sonotoki as the time, this is a good translation. So the mother and son stood still, tatazumu, with clasped hands at the lakeside, a short distance away from the rest of the clan. So again, notice how the order of this sentence was just kind of flip-flopped. Instead of saying, the mother and son, who were a short distance away from the rest of their clan, you put that short distance away from the rest of the clan part, you just dunked it over at the end of the sentence. Because it interrupts the sentence if you kind of try to sneak it in at the beginning. The most important part of the sentence is the mother and son stood still with clasped hands at the lakeside. That's the most important part of the sentence, that first part that I isolated. The second part of the sentence that's not as important is that they were a short distance away from the rest of the clan. They waited for the time to arrive. If time had been translated as moment, this would have been a lot better. They waited for the moment to arrive. And it was a good move also to change the sentence from one into two sentences. Sometimes it works a lot better to do that since Japanese has so many run-on sentences. Small Sarah translated this as, the mother and child, comma, slightly separated from the others, comma. So see, Small Sarah did what I just said, not necessarily the best thing to do. Tightly clasped hands, semicolon. I wasn't brave enough to just end the sentence there. They had waited for this moment. So they had waited for this moment, and they waited for the moment to arrive. They're both actually pretty decent translations. Like, again, this sonotoki implies that this is a moment that they have been waiting for. Like, they knew that they were going to do this ritual, like, all year, and it's this long anticipated, like, finally, this moment is about to arrive. So they had waited for this moment is not exactly a bad translation of that. It's like they had their long anticipated moment was about to arrive, and they waited for the long anticipated moment is kind of what that means. They waited for the moment to arrive is fine. Now, sentence number 2. 次第に激しさを増す主を呼ぶ声に応えるように、comma. That's part 1 of the sentence. 風も波も嵐のごとくたけり始めた. Alright, so, 次第に is like gradually. 激しさを増す. So, to increase in violence, to increase in intensity. 主を呼ぶ声. The voices calling for their lord. に答えるように as if to answer to. So as if to answer the voices calling more and more with more and more intensity for their lord, comma. 風も波も both the winds and the waves. 嵐のごとく like a storm. たけり始めた so like raged, swelled. Began to rage and swell, excuse me, hajimeta. So my patron translated this as, the wind and waves began to swell like a storm in response to the two increasingly desperate calls to the Lord. So hageshisa in this case was translated as desperate. That's not bad. I like that. I would change desperate calls to their Lord. The wind and waves began to swell like a storm in response to the increasingly, I would add the increasingly desperate calls to their Lord. But yeah, that's a pretty good translation. Small Sarah translated that as if answering, this is beautiful. Terrible, I mean, as if answering the voices calling to their Lord. Again, this yoni, I kept translating it as if. Bad translation. As if answering, it's not technically wrong. It just sounds weird. As if answering the voices calling to their Lord, the wind and waves and storms began to move furiously. So small Sarah missed that gotoku means, it's a metaphor simile sort of word. It's like no yoni. It's like. So I took it literally, like the wind and waves and storms began to move furiously. So another thing that small Sarah did wrong here was she thought that the winds and waves were the ones that were hageshisa o masu. She thought that the increasing in intensity applied to the wind and the waves. I mean, it technically does. They are increasing in intensity. But in the sentence, it's the nushi o yobu koe is the thing that is increasing in intensity. The voices calling for their Lord are the things that are increasing in intensity. So this is actually like a little wrong. But again, not technically wrong because the wind and the waves are also growing in intensity. The original Japanese sentence was saying both of these things are growing in intensity, and it's like the nature was responding basically to the voices that were growing in intensity. Nature in turn was also growing in intensity. So it's still not technically wrong, but it's a little less clear and worded a little bit stilted. Hayagane no yoni, another yoni, there's so much yoni. Uchi hajimeru kodo ni, shounen no iki wa midare, comma, zenshin kara hiya ase ga fukidashite kita. So hayagane no yoni, like a bell, like a gong. Uchi hajimeru kodo. So kodo, your heartbeat, your pulse that is beginning to pound. Uchi hajimeru. Ni, so at the pulse that was beginning to pound like a gong, like a bell, like an alarm bell. Shounen no iki wa midare. The boy's breath, midareru is like to go wild, to go erratic, to be breathing like instead of to be like just wild and syncopated and off rhythm instead of normal. Zenshin kara, from his whole body. Hiya ase is like a chilled sweat. Fukidashite kita, like started like spurting out, basically. Cold sweat started spurting out all over his body as his breath became erratic from his heartbeat beginning to pound like alarm bells, basically, is what that literally means. My patron translated that as the son's heart. It's shounen, not musuko. I would say her son's heart or the boy's heart. The son's heart is kind of weird. The son's heart began to beat quickly, and his breathing became labored. I kind of like that, labored for midare. And semicolon, his whole body broke out into a cold sweat. I might have just put a period there. We also like M dashes today. If you're not a friend of M dash yet, become acquainted with M dash. It's a great way of like Instead of making a period or a semicolon, which can look overly formal, or like a comma, just use an em dash. It's a great way of separating ideas. His whole body broke out into a cold sweat, so that's a good translation for fukidashite kita, broke out. Small Sarah translated that as like the sudden sounding of an alarm bell. This is more literal. The boys breathe, hyphen, so that could have been an em dash. Or a comma. I think a comma would have made more sense there. The boy's breathing became irregular. The boy's breathing became irregular versus the boy's breathing became labored. Irregular is a little more like literal. I like labored though. It creates that image of he's struggling to breathe. And as a result of struggling to breathe, it's irregular versus just became irregular. Why? Why did it become irregular? There's no emotionality there. And a cold sweat formed all over his body, so formed is a bit weak. Broke out is better. It's a little closer to fukidasu as well, which is like geysers. It broke out. More dialogue. Oritachita mae! Oritachita mae! Oritachita mae! Tenko-sama! And then there's 2 small tsus followed by 4 exclamation points. So I have a video about this somewhere. What a small tsu does is it basically adds like a glottal stop. So instead of tenko-sama, and I just kind of, it's tenko-sama, and it like ends abruptly with like a silent. That's what small tsus do. And then 4 exclamation points, which again is a little unnatural for English. We would usually just do 3 exclamation points or 1 exclamation point. Again, I personally don't care. I kind of like going crazy with exclamation points. But yeah, you would do just 1 or 3, not 4. So my patron translated this as, descend from the heavens, Lord Tenko. Again, they combined the 3 now, oritachita mae, into just descend from the heavens. I like that. It's more concise. Lord Tenko from Tenko-sama. That's not wrong. And then small Sarah translated that as arise. Remember from episode 1, I translated oritachita mae instead of descend from the heavens as arise. Both of these are commands for the Lord to appear before them, basically. And I think small Sarah, me as a youngster, decided to do arise instead of descend because Tenko is a devil and he would be coming up from hell. That's probably where I got that from. And then I kept Tenko-sama instead of Lord Tenko. That's not wrong, that's not right. And I did 3 exclamation points and my patron only did 2. So yeah, 2 exclamation points in the professional biz were discouraged from doing 2. It's either 1 or 3. And in rare cases, we could do probably like 6 or something. But yeah, usually it's just 1 or 3. All right, now we have a very long, it's 2 long sentences, not a very long sentence. 息子の異変に気づいた母が、ひざまずいてその顔を覗き込んだ時だった。Period. So 息子の異変. 異変 is like a change, a transformation, a change in appearance. に気づいた, so noticed her son's change in appearance. Haha. So the mother who noticed the change in her son's appearance, ひざまずいて knelt その顔を覗き込んだ時だった. So その顔を覗き込んだ. If you had the period there, it would be peered into his face. So, その顔, not that face, his face, because we already established that it's her son that we're talking about. So, the mother, noticing the change in her son's appearance, knelt and peered into his face. And then it's 覗き込んだ時だった. So, the moment. It was the moment when the mother, noticing the change in her son's appearance, knelt down and peered into his face. That would be a really bad literal translation of that. The tokidatta, that is very, very Japaneseism. And I'm curious to see how my patron and small Sarah translated that. So let's see. The mother, noticing something was wrong with her son, knelt and looked into his face. Good. You passed, patron. So a rookie mistake and a very amateur thing to do would be to translate that tokidatta, like that was the time or that was the moment. It's sort of like, it's a way to signal in Japanese prose like, okay, so just when she did this thing, then it happened. That's kind of what that tokiratta thing does. But you don't do that in English. You're not like, the moment she turned and looked, then it, I mean, you could do like, she did that, period, then it happened, period. You could express it that way, but you wouldn't want to be like, the time that she turned and knelt. So yeah, the mother, comma, noticing something was wrong with her son, comma, knelt and looked into his face. Good translation. Small Sarah, his mother, comma, noticing her son's sudden illness, comma, peered anxiously at his face as she knelt. Okay, so yeah, this is a little messy and the order of operations is a little weird. She knelt and then she looked into his face, I would say. Not like looked at his face as she knelt. I don't know, I guess you could do that. It's just kind of weird. Noticing her son's sudden illness, I guess I thought Ihan was illness. Like I probably just couldn't figure out how to translate that properly. Like I might have asked my host dad, what does Ihan mean? And he'd explain to me in Japanese, oh, it's when you're feeling well at 1 minute and then you don't look like you're feeling well. So I probably was like, oh, that means illness. I don't know, my speculation. But yeah, illness, that's not a good translation of Ihan. It's more just like a change. Yeah, noticing something was wrong with her son. I think that makes a lot more sense versus like sudden illness. 漆黒の湖の真上に、兄弟な影のようなものがそそり立つ気配がした。So, 漆黒の湖, so the jet black 漆黒の湖 lake の真上に, so right above. So right above the jet black lake, 兄弟な影のようなものが, again, this のような, this has come up like 4 times so far, I think, in just these last 2 pages of this novel. So a thing that is like a giant shadow is what that literally means. そそり立つ気配がした. 気配がした. So 気配is a presence. She sensed the presence of something slithering that resembled a giant shadow right above the jet black lake. That's like literally what all that means, parsed out. So my patron translated that as, she felt the presence. So kehai ga shita, again, the end of the sentence is coming at the beginning. She felt the presence of a large shadow slithering, sosori tatsu, around above the surface of the jet black lake. So this is another classic example of just the sentence was just flipped. Like everything that used to come at the end now comes at the beginning. Everything that used to come at the beginning now comes at the end. And that's good. Hi, Miney. You want to help? Oh, or not. And then a cat slithered above the lake. Small Sarah translated that as, above the pitch black lake, comma, so I kept the Japanese order intact. It seemed like an enormous shadow had formed. So yeah, I left that seemed like, kehai ga shita yona mono. It's like, there was a presence of something that was sort of like a shadowed thing. It seemed like an enormous shadow had formed. Yeah, I think small Sarah probably just didn't know what sosori tatsu was, or didn't feel like looking it up, or asked her host what it meant and got an inconclusive answer. And again, it's not like a wrong translation, it's just, it's lacking some information. And Japanese, again, will sound vague with no yo na mono, ki ga shita, kehai ga shita. These are all kind of vaguisms, but in English you don't want those to be so vague. So my patron's translation of that was better. Kaze mo nami mo pitari to yanda. Very short, simple, straightforward sentence. The winds and the waves stopped with a pitari. So pitari is onomatopoeia. It's kind of like when the boop, it stops. It just suddenly, boop, it stops. The wind and the waves came to a standstill. That's how my patron translated that. And small Sarah translated that as, the wind and waves stopped immediately. I don't really like the stopped immediately. Like, came to a standstill. That paints a good picture. You're imagining, oh, this is happening, and then came to a standstill. Versus, the wind and the waves stopped immediately. It implies that it's like, stopped immediately. I imagine like running into a brick wall for stopping immediately. But really, they're just like, and they just kind of come to a standstill. Unlike the people running on the top of my floor above me. So yeah, again, they're both technically correct translations, but the way my patron worded it just paints a better picture than stopped immediately. Shounen wa kuwatto another onomatopoeia, 目を見開いた. So, くわっと, it's like, bah! 目を見開いた. So, 見開いた to open wide and look, basically. Opened his eyes wide. Like, blah! Like, blah! My patron translated that as the boy opened his eyes. So my patron left out the descriptive kuatto, like whoa. Small Sarah translated that as the boy opened his eyes wide in shock. So Small Sarah expressed the kuatto, that sound effect, as in shock. And me o mi hiraita, opened wide. I think today I would have just done the boy opened his eyes wide, or the boy's eyes shot open, I think would be a better translation of that. Because that implies, again, the picture we're trying to paint here is the boy's eyes were like, kind of like that. Imagine that, you know, if you watch anime, you know what I'm talking about, like when the eyes go, and they're just like suddenly open. So I think Small Sarah's translation was a little better than my patron's here, because the boy opened his eyes is just like, he opened his eyes. How did he open them? The kuatto, mi hiraita, like implies more like, oh my god. My hair is in my microphone. I hope it's not sawa-sawa-y. See episode 1 to know what sawa-sawa means. Okay, actually more like kasa-kasa. That's more like a rustling sound effect for clothes. Hi, Miney. Oh, we're almost done, and then Mommy can give you attention. I'm sorry. I know I've been neglecting you. I've been such a mean mommy. Sorry, quick cat break. Hi, Miney. I love you. Yes, my... Oh, hey. Anyway, the boy's eyes shot open. その瞳が強大な影の中に光る2つの青白い目とぶつかった瞬間、少年は気を失った。So その瞳, again, it's not those eyes or that eye, but his eyes. We already know we're talking about the boy. The boy's eyes. 強大な影の中. So we mentioned this 強大な影 in a former sentence, the giant shadowy thing. 強大な影の中に光る. So shining inside the giant shadow. 2つの青白い目. So 青白い, if you look at those kanji, it's blue-white, so like pale, basically. 2つの, two pale eyes, shining or glowing in the middle of the giant shadow. とぶつかった瞬間. So what is ぶつかるing? ぶつかった to hit. その瞳, the boy's eyes が、2つの青白い目とぶつかった瞬間. So the moment the boy's eyes met with the pair of glowing white eyes inside the giant shadowy thing, 少年は気を失った. The boy lost consciousness, or the boy fainted. So my patron translated that as, the instant his eyes met, the pale white eyes within the huge shadow, the boy fainted. Small Sarah translated that as, the instant, I did the same thing, his eyes met with the huge pale blue eyes shining out of the enormous shadow, he lost consciousness. So Small Sarah applied the huge and enormous twice when she didn't have to. It's the enormous shadow that is enormous. The two eyes are not enormous necessarily. It doesn't say anywhere in the Japanese that they're enormous. I think Small Sarah just decided, they're enormous. The instant his eyes met with the shunkan, the instant his eyes met with the huge pale blue eyes, with the pale white eyes. Pale blue versus pale white. Pale white is a little closer to what it is. Aoi doesn't always mean blue or green. Sometimes it does mean white. Like kao ga masao, that uses aoi, that uses that kanji. That means your face is pale. It doesn't mean your face is blue or green. It means you're pale. Sickly. He lost consciousness versus the boy fainted. I prefer lost consciousness over fainted, but I think that's just my personal preference. It's not better necessarily, and it's not right or wrong. Both of these are technically right, except that Small Sarah added the huge when they didn't need to be there. But yeah, And that is the end of the prologue of this light novel and the end of this episode. All right, anyway, thank you for watching this. I hope you tune into the next episode on this series. And thank you to my patrons for helping me produce this series. If you want to contribute your translations to these videos and have them evaluated, you can join my $12 tier and have your translations evaluated by me in these very videos if you want. Thank you to my patrons at that tier and all the tiers, and I want to give a special shout out to Greg Lay and Henry Roaming. You're all awesome, and bye!